classes.
And Senna goes through into the lead.
McLaren's main focus while designing the Senna was to achieve faster lap times by giving the car a lightweight design and aerodynamic elements. The car is largely based on the 720S, but has a modified carbon fiber structure and engine. According to McLaren, the Senna is, quote, the most track-focused road car we have ever built, and it will set the fastest lap times of any McLaren to date. This street-legal sports car has a top speed of 208 miles per hour and can go to 60 miles per hour in 2.7 seconds. The McLaren Senna is priced at a whopping $1,050,000. Production will be limited to 500 units. Each will be made by hand. Besides the standard version, there are also several iterations of this model, including the Senna GTR, Senna LM, and the McLaren Sabre, which is made exclusively for the US market. It is the fastest Senna model with a top speed of 218 miles per hour. Fun fact, McLaren and Lego partnered to build a full-scale build of the McLaren Senna. In total, it took them about 5,000 hours and 467,854 Lego bricks to build the car.
The dihedral doors are made entirely out of Lego bricks.
Considered the true successor of the McLaren F1, the McLaren Speedtail is a combination of luxury and performance. The hybrid sports car was unveiled in 2018, and 2 years later, production began. The Speedtail has multiple technology features. For instance, the car is able to recharge while driving. It also has electrochromatic glass, which darkens the glass at the push of a button, eliminating the need for a sun visor. Another cool feature is that it doesn't have door mirrors and instead uses HD cameras. The Speedtail is also incredibly fast, with a top speed of 250 miles per hour, making it the fastest McLaren. Just like the McLaren F1, the Speedtail also has a 3-seat layout, with the driver sitting at the center of the car, slightly forward of 2 passenger seats. Fun fact, the Speedtail is one of the rarest McLaren cars, with only 106 examples that are expected to be made. All have already been sold for a price of around $2.7 million. McLaren Elva is one of the latest additions to the McLaren Ultimate series. The car was released in 2020 and has no windows or roof. The Elva is designed as the company's lightest sports car ever. The name Elva is derived from French words Elle va, which means she goes. With 804 horsepower, the Elva is able to go to 198 miles per hour and reach 60 miles per hour in 2.8 seconds. Surprisingly, the Elva doesn't have a windshield and instead uses the McLaren Air Active Management System, which channels the airflow above and around the passengers, creating what McLaren calls the oasis of calm. In 2021, McLaren redesigned the Elva with a windscreen. At first, production was limited to 399 units. However, the production total was reduced to 249 units. McLaren CEO Mike Flewitt stated that the reason for this decision was customer feedback encouraging the exclusivity. The McLaren Elva comes at a base price of $1,700,000. And finally, there is the McLaren Artura that will be released in 2022. It is the successor of the McLaren 570S and is designed for lightweight and aerodynamic efficiency. McLaren's CEO called the Artura, quote, the next generation hybrid supercar, a distillation of everything we've ever learned. The hybrid sports car is able to reach 205 miles per hour, which is slightly faster than its predecessor. The Artura can also reach 60 miles per hour in 2.8 seconds. With a base price of $225,000, the Artura isn't as expensive as many other McLaren models. From the legendary McLaren F1 all the way to the McLaren Artura that has yet to be released, McLaren continues to create unique and innovative cars. There is one suggestion that keeps popping up. Well, in fact, it is by far the most requested video on my channel, so here you go. This is the evolution of Sega! Sega's history begins in sunny Hawaii, where three businessmen founded Service Games in 1946. That's where the name Sega comes from. It's an abbreviation of service and games. Service because of military service, and games because the company provided slot machines for U.S. military bases. However, when the U.S. government banned slot machines in 1952, Martin Bromley, one of the original founders, sent employees to Tokyo to establish Service Games of Japan to provide slot machines to U.S. bases in Japan. However, the U.S. government came knocking on the door again in 1960 for investigating criminal business practices. Service Games changed its name, stopped focusing on slot machines, and moved away from U.S. military bases. The company acquired Rosen Enterprises to form Sega Enterprises. Sega imported coin-operated amusement machines like jukeboxes, pinball machines, and gun games. These were bought second-hand and often required frequent maintenance. This led to the company developing its own games. Their first official game was a submarine simulator called Periscope, which was released globally in the late 1960s. From there, Sega edged its way into the booming arcade market, becoming one of the top 5 arcade game manufacturers in the United States. During the early 80s, Sega created many games and the company revenues rose to $214 million. When the arcade market took a downturn, though, Sega moved into home consoles. Fun fact, the name Sega was first used in 1954 on a slot machine called the Diamond Star. Sega first made the SC3000, a computer with a built-in keyboard. But when Sega learned that Nintendo had plans to create a games-only console, they decided to do the same. This was the start of the console wars between Sega and Nintendo that would continue for many years to come. Both the SC1000 and the Famicom were released in Japan on exactly the same day, July 15, 1983. Games that were featured in the SG-1000 lineup included Super Tank, Congo Bongo, which looks a lot like Donkey Kong, Space Invaders, a true classic arcade game, and James Bond 007, which was the second James Bond game in the whole franchise. And although these games were fun, they weren't as popular and recognizable as many of the Nintendo games, like Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Nonetheless, the SC-1000 became a huge success. While Sega expected to have sold 50,000 units by the end of 1983, they ended up selling 160,000 units. The SG-1000 Mark II came out a year after the first console. It was redesigned and had a port to connect an optional keyboard. There was also an optional add-on called the Card Catcher that allowed users to play Sega card games in addition to cartridges. Fun fact, Hideki Sato, who designed many of the Sega consoles, thought the original cartridges looked like small black tombstones, so he replaced them with Sega My Cards. He later stated that it was one of his proudest achievements during the SG-1000 era. In October 1985, the Sega Mark III was launched in Japan, which featured enhanced graphical capabilities over its predecessors. However, the console was not successful at launch. 1 year later, the Sega Mark III was completely rebranded as the Master System for its launch in North America, with the hope that it would do better than it did in Japan. The pressure was very, very high, Sega developer Mark Cerny said. So high that an average game would only have 3 months of development time. No wonder many games at launch weren't that memorable. Luckily, more memorable games arrived in the following years, including Prince of Persia, Castle of Illusion, Alex Kidd in Miracle World. And last, but definitely not least, Sonic the Hedgehog, which would become the most recognizable and popular franchise for Sega. Nintendo had also rebranded their Famicom system for the North American market with the NES or Nintendo Entertainment System. Both Sega and Nintendo spent around $15 million to promote their consoles in North America.
The Sega Master System. Hang on. With more accurate control, more detailed graphics, more levels of play.
Awesome!
In 1990, Sega released the Master System 2, a cheaper and smaller model in North America and Europe. While Nintendo dominated the American market, Sega was successful in Europe. But overall, Sega turned out to be no match for Nintendo, mainly because of their hugely successful and popular franchises like Donkey Kong, Metroid, The Legend of Zelda, and of course, Super Mario Bros. While the Sega Master System sold around 13 million units globally, Nintendo managed to sell a whopping 62 million units of the NES. Fun fact, while most people associate Sonic the Hedgehog with Sega and recognize him as their mascot, Alex the Kid was actually Sega's first mascot. He first appeared on the Master System in 1986 in the game Alex Kidd in Miracle World. In fact, when the Master System 2 came out, it would typically have Alex Kidd pre-installed on the system. In October 1988, Sega unleashed their masterpiece, the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside of the US. It was the first 16-bit console, which was a huge leap forward compared to its 8-bit predecessor. This meant that games were more fluid, 3D, faster, and had much more colors. Sega heavily promoted their console's revolutionary blast processing, which allowed gamers to enjoy high-speed titles like Sonic. The console had some tough competition with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. Nintendo at this point had a much bigger following and also a larger budget, so Sega had to think outside of the box to gain more attention. That's when they released their ad campaign and started to take jabs at Nintendo.
What if you don't have blast processing?
And one of my favorite commercials of all time.
16-bit arcade hits. What Nintendo don't.
While Nintendo was very family-friendly with cute, fun games like Super Mario World, Sega wasn't, and released games like Mortal Kombat, which has often been criticized for its unrestrained use of graphic and bloody violence. But Sega also had many friendly titles like Disney's Aladdin, Lion King, and of course, the Sonic the Hedgehog games. Nintendo had Mario as their mascot, and Sega also wanted an iconic mascot. This, of course, became Sonic. However, finding a great mascot wasn't easy. Sega made all kinds of designs, including this rabbit and an American wolf. Eventually, Sega made a wise decision to use Sonic. Sonic was fast and edgy, just like the Sega Genesis was meant to be. Sega released a smaller and lighter version of the console dubbed the Genesis 2 in 1993. In addition, a handheld version called the Genesis Nomad came out in 1995, with the ability to play the same cartridges on a portable device. It had some powerful technical specs and was the first 16-bit handheld. The handheld was based on the MegaJet, which was designed for use on airline flights in Japan, which is pretty cool, I guess. The Genesis Nomad sold about 1 million units, but was considered a commercial failure. Overall, the Sega Genesis with all its variants ended up selling 35 million units, and came closer than ever before to Nintendo. However, Nintendo still got the upper hand by selling over 49 million units of the SNES. Fun fact, South Korea had a ban on Japanese products, so Nintendo distributed their SNES console by Hyundai, and it received the name Super Comboy. Sega, on the other hand, distributed their Sega Genesis console by Samsung, and it received the bizarre name Super Aladdin Boy.
Hang on a second.
The Genesis Nomad wasn't Sega's first attempt at a handheld console. That honor fell to the Game Gear, which was released in 1990. It was up against the Game Boy. Yeah, Sega really couldn't catch a break. and its specs were actually very impressive for the time and far superior to the Game Boys. It even had a color screen long before Nintendo released the Game Boy Color. However, the extra power needed to run Sega's Game Gear meant that battery life was a lot shorter. It only had around 4 hours of battery life compared to the 30-hour battery life of the Game Boy. It also cost significantly more than its rival, priced at $149 at launch compared to just $89. Third-party game developers weren't interested in developing games for the Game Gear. That led to a game library that was very similar to that seen on the Master System, with games like Prince of Persia, Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, and Sonic the Hedgehog. The Game Boy ended up outselling Sega's handheld by more than 10 times, totaling 118 million sales compared to the Game Gear's 10.6 million. In 1991, Sega released a peripheral for the Genesis called the Sega CD, also known as the Mega CD outside of the US. It is considered a console within its own right, since the processing power of the original system was boosted and games could be played on CD, which allowed for games to be nearly 320 times larger than the Genesis cartridges.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? Huh? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show them!
A total of 205 games were made for it, including Mickey Mania, Sonic CD, and Batman Returns. There was also Desert Bus, where players do nothing but drive a bus on a desert road for miles on end. It is widely considered to be the most boring game of all time. The Sega CD performed poorly compared to its parent console. Only 2.2 million Sega CDs were sold. Fun fact, in 1993, the United States Congress began to hold hearings on video game violence marketed towards children. Sega was known for its violent games, including Sega CD's Night Trap, a terrible horror game. This scene sparked a lot of controversy as it was seen as too violent. Surprisingly, it isn't that graphic at all. This even led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, which gives age and content ratings to video games. The controversy got Sega a lot of publicity and only reinforced the edgy attitude of the company. But that edginess wasn't seen on the Sega Pico, released in 1994. It was designed as an educational and entertaining system for children aged between 2 and 8 years old. Children could play games like Tails and the Music Maker and Sonic the Hedgehog's Game World. In 2005, Sega launched an updated version of the Pico called the Advanced Pico Bina, which also worked as a handheld. The Pico was a hit in Japan but failed to catch on elsewhere. Still, Sega reported sales of 3.8 million Pico consoles, so it still did better than the Sega CD. In a last-ditch attempt to prolong the life of the Genesis even further, Sega released another peripheral in 1994, the 32X. Sega of America and Sega of Japan had their differences if the 32X should have been a peripheral or a new console. These two would continue to clash over many disagreements. The 32X added support for 32-bit games as opposed to just 16-bit games, and was therefore capable of playing ROM cartridges that were different to the Genesis itself. Titles that players could enjoy on the 32X were Doom, Mortal Kombat 2, Virtua Fighter, and Knuckles Chaotix, a Sonic game that features Knuckles as the main character. Only 800,000 units were sold, and the 32X is considered a commercial failure. The successor to the Sega Genesis is the Sega Saturn, released in 1994 in Japan and a few months later with a different design in North America. However, they shot themselves in the foot when launching the console in America, as they made a surprise announcement during E3 that the Saturn would be available that same day. While Sega thought this would be a major win and a positive surprise for everyone, they didn't count on annoying all the retailers who hadn't been told and weren't prepared for the rush. Walmart and Best Buy even refused to stock the system in its games at all due to the poor communication. To make matters worse, Sega's price of $399 was seen as a good value by their own staff until Sony announced that their new console, the original PlayStation, would be $299. Oh, and the Saturn was up against the Nintendo 64 that year too. Meanwhile, due to long-standing disagreements between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, Tom Kalinske, the CEO of Sega of America, left the company. Sega's marketing team did little to help either, freaking out their audience with more weird adverts that didn't really showcase the system's abilities.
He will lead you. Watch.
While some franchise classics like Virtua Fighter did make it onto the Saturn, there never came a Sonic 4, which wasn't a smart move by Sega. Instead, players received Sonic R, Sonic Jam, and Sonic 3D Blast. It was no surprise that Saturn turned out to be another failure for Sega, only selling 9.3 million units compared to sales of 32.9 million Nintendo 64s and 102.4 million PlayStations. Sega's final attempt at a serious gaming console came in 1998 with the Dreamcast. The controller featured a VMU, which is a memory card with a screen. Some games used it to show additional data, like inventory or maps. The Dreamcast was considered to be ahead of its time and was initially successful. The launch titles were decent as well. There was Sonic Adventure, Mortal Kombat Gold,
Round 2. Fight!
Soul Calibur. Plus, later there came more great games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Sonic Adventure 2, and many others. Even the price at launch of $199 seemed reasonable. However, the gaming gods were once again not on Sega's side. Despite some early success, the Dreamcast failed to gain enough momentum before the wildly popular PlayStation 2 came out in 2000, followed by the Xbox in 2001. Sega only sold 9.1 million units compared to sales of 24 million for the original Xbox, and a whopping 155 million units were sold of the PlayStation 2. Sega discontinued the Sega Dreamcast in 2001, just 18 months after its release in North America. With yet another failure, Sega lost a massive amount of money. In the last year of the Dreamcast alone, Sega lost $200 million. No wonder they decided to stop making video game consoles. Instead, they became a third-party developer, and surprisingly, ever since, they've been working with companies like Nintendo rather than trying to compete against them. Who would have thought? How many of Sega's consoles did you own, and which was your favorite? Let us know in the comments. When it comes to gaming, there's one company that evoked more nostalgia than any other. That, of course, is Nintendo. It continues to publish and develop some of the most popular video game franchises in the world and competes among the big three to this day. This is the evolution of Nintendo. Nintendo's origins can actually be traced all the way back to 1889 when it was founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi as Yamauchi Nintendo. Mr. Yamauchi started off by producing handmade Hanafuda, which is a type of Japanese playing cards. In 1959, Nintendo, which changed its name to Nintendo Playing Card, entered into an agreement with Walt Disney to use the Disney characters on their cards. A few years later, the company's name was shortened to just Nintendo, with nobody being 100% sure what the word Nintendo actually means, though it's thought to loosely translate as leave luck to heaven. Over the following years, playing cards became less popular among Japanese households, and in 1964, the value of the company's stock began to plummet from 900 to just 60 yen. Nintendo was in heavy debt, and Yamauchi was desperate to find the next big thing. So they decided to invest in new ventures, like packages of instant rice, a taxi service, and the not-so-very family-friendly Love Hotels. Eventually, Nintendo decided to venture into the weapons business, the toy market, and released Japan's first electronic toy in 1970, the Nintendo Beam Gun. This would become an ancestor to the NES Zapper that was later used in video games such as Duck Hunt. In 1972, an American company named Magnavox created the first commercial home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Nintendo developed and produced a light gun accessory for the console. 2 years later, Nintendo also secured the rights to distribute the Magnavox Odyssey in Japan. Having witnessed firsthand how popular video games were, Nintendo began to work on building its own consoles. Nintendo's first official console was a joint effort with partner Mitsubishi. Released in 1977, it was given the unimaginative title of Color TV Game 6, with the number 6 denoting how many games could be played on it. Soon after, they also released the Color TV Game 15, TV Game Racing 112, Block Kazushi, and the computer TV game. It's hard to imagine that games on these consoles were really this simple. At the same time, Nintendo was also working on developing games for arcades, many of which would later be ported to consoles, including Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers. The company's first venture into handheld electronic gaming came in 1980 with the Game & Watch. The product derived its name from featuring just a single game, as well as a clock on an LCD screen. Multiple series of Game & Watch were made, some looking drastically different, like the multi-screen that featured 2 screens and a clamshell design that would later be replicated in future handheld Nintendo consoles. Until 1991, Nintendo released around 60 different Game & Watch games, like Ball, Parachute, Snoopy, Donkey Kong Jr., and Mario the Juggler. To keep gamers entertained, most games came with 2 modes, Game A representing the easy mode, and Game B representing a faster, harder version of the same game. The Game & Watch sold 43.4 million units worldwide. Fun fact, Gunpei Yokoi got the idea to create the Game & Watch when he saw a bored man play with his calculator in the train. In 1985, Nintendo really started to stand out from the crowd as they released the much-loved Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. It was Nintendo's first home video game console released outside of Japan. A different-looking version had already been released within Japan in 1983, known as the Family Computer, or Famicom. And while some of the games and art styles varied, the consoles were essentially the same in terms of performance. To say the NES was significant is an understatement. It helped to revive the video game industry after the crash in 1983, going on to sell 62 million units worldwide and set the record for the longest surviving video game system in history. It stayed on the American market until 1995, and in Japan, it wasn't discontinued until 2003. Many of Nintendo's most successful game franchises were born on the NES, like Final Fantasy, Castlevania, Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda. Duck Hunt was also very popular, but the most sold game for the NES with over 40 million copies sold was, of course, Super Mario Brothers. The NES was praised for its simple yet at the time innovative controller. Joysticks were the common method of control before Nintendo designed and patented their D-pad. Even though the trend has now reversed, the joysticks often being preferred, D-pads were much better for playing 2D games like Donkey Kong. Fun fact, Donkey Kong was the first game that involved jumping and is therefore considered to be the first true platformer. In 1989, Nintendo offered more versatility to gamers with the handheld, brick-like Game Boy that used interchangeable cartridges. This meant that gamers could simply buy a game rather than a new device each time they wanted a different experience. Remaining popular until this day, the Game Boy was portable, durable, and came with hugely popular titles like Super Mario Land, Kirby's Dream Land, Pokemon Red and Blue, and Tetris. Nintendo released a compact version, the Game Boy Pocket, in 1996. It was notably smaller and lighter and came in different colors. This Game Boy had a black and white display rather than the green tinted display of the original Game Boy. The battery life, however, was decreased from 15 hours for the original to roughly 10 hours. 2 years later, the Game Boy Light hit shelves exclusively in Japan. The Game Boy screen was difficult to see in the dark, and the Game Boy Light fixed that problem with a backlight. Next came the Game Boy Color, released in 1998. It came in colorful colors, and like the name suggests, the Game Boy Color could display games in color. Many games were re-released with color, like The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening and Tetris. Other games included Pokemon Gold and Silver, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, and The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages and Seasons. Needless to say, but the Game Boy and Game Boy Color were a massive success. In total, 118.7 million units were sold. Fun fact, in 1993, a Russian cosmonaut named Alexander Serbrov took his Game Boy to space to play Tetris. The Game Boy is said to have orbited Earth 3,000 times and was sold at auction for $1,220. The much-anticipated successor to the NES was the SNES, released in 1991 in the United States with the new S standing for Super. Hence the Famicom, released 1 year earlier in Japan, also became the Super Famicom. The SNES was a 16-bit console that saw a significant increase in processing power, audio, and more advanced cartridges. At the time, Nintendo and Sega were going head-to-head in what is referred to as the Bit Wars, with advertising campaigns taking jabs at each other and both claiming to have the superior console.
What Nintendo?
Eventually, Nintendo got the upper hand and ended up outselling its closest rival, with 49 million units sold compared to Sega Genesis's sales of 35 million. The third best-selling console at the time was the TurboGrafx 16, which lagged far behind with sales of 10 million units. Games that appeared on the SNES included the first Mario Kart game, as well as sequels to popular franchises such as Final Fantasy VI, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The SNES controller got a makeover too, with rounded edges replacing the former rectangular design and additional buttons being added to both the front and shoulders of the gamepad. In 1995, the Virtual Boy was released, but it was a commercial failure. You had to put your head in a mounted display, which was like a VR headset. VR didn't add to games at all, it was just a novelty. It was also uncomfortable to wear, not portable, too expensive, and games were not in full color, but in black and red. Those colors were just unappealing, especially when compared to the colorful games in other Nintendo consoles. It featured a number of games, including Mario's Tennis, Wario Land,
Wait till they get a load of me!
and 3D Tetris. But those games weren't played that much since people experienced dizziness and headaches from this thing. The Virtual Boy is one of the worst-selling consoles of all time, with roughly 770,000 units sold. Fun fact, Nintendo claimed that a color display would have made the system too expensive and that it would result in jumpy images, so the company opted for a monochrome display. Nintendo began to face tougher opposition when they released their next generation of console, the Nintendo 64, in 1996. After all, they now had to compete with the very successful PlayStation, which had already been out for 2 years at that point. Despite quadrupling their bits to 64 and outselling the Sega Saturn with sales figures of 33 million to just 9 million, the cartridge-based N64 was no match for the CD-based PlayStation, which took over the crown as market leader and sold more than double the amount of the other two combined. In a trend that still holds true for many today, Nintendo came to be recognized as a source of fun and entertainment for families rather than a serious gaming console for individuals. Nintendo's games tended to have much more cartoon-like graphics and fantasy-based characters compared to the added realism brought by other machines. Having said that, the N64 did take major steps forward in terms of modern 3D graphics and featured iconic titles that are still enjoyed today. It had a fantastic library of adventure and party games like Super Mario 64, Super Smash Bros., Pokemon Stadium,
Savage attack! Smack the weak spot!
Donkey Kong 64, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart 64, and GoldenEye 007. The N64 controller was a controversial change, featuring a three-pronged design with a central joystick, D-pad, face and shoulder buttons, plus a trigger button at the back. Fun fact, the epic multiplayer mode for GoldenEye was a last-minute addition. Developer Steve Ellis had access to the code written for a single-player game and decided to turn GoldenEye into a multiplayer game within a month. So, thanks, Steve. 3 years later than planned, in 2001, the Game Boy Advance hit store shelves. It had a landscape design and included shoulder buttons, which is why they called it the Advance. With processing power similar to that of the SNES, the Advance's game library was full of SNES ports, allowing gamers to play the same epic titles while on the move. This, of course, included the greats like Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and games from the Final Fantasy series. Pokemon games like Ruby and Sapphire were also big hits with the Advance owners. A compact, foldable version of the Game Boy Advance came out in 2003, known as the SP. The original Game Boy Advance received complaints due to the dark screen, and the SP fixed that problem using a significantly brighter LCD screen and an internal front light. It was also the first of Nintendo's handheld lineup that had a rechargeable battery. The Game Boy Micro came in 2005 and was much smaller than the original. The design could be changed with interchangeable faceplates. The Game Boy Micro did not sell well because the Nintendo DS was already released at this time. In total, the Nintendo Advance family sold over 81.5 million units. A console you probably never heard of before is the Pokemon Mini, released in 2001. It was the smallest game system Nintendo created and themed around the Pokemon franchise. In total, only 10 games were released for the Pokemon Mini, most of which were only available in Japan. Although it's unknown how many units were sold, the Pokemon Mini certainly wasn't a success. It was discontinued a year after its release. If the Nintendo 64 was up against it, then the Nintendo GameCube was even more so. Released in 2001, it was up against the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft's new system, the Xbox. The GameCube looked much more kid-friendly and like a toy in comparison to its rivals. Despite its name, it wasn't even a cube. It measured 5.9 by 6.3 by 4.3 inches. Nintendo managed to sell 22 million GameCubes. Instead of using cartridges, the system switched to using mini-discs and did not use CDs or DVDs like its competitors. Whereas DVDs could store up to 8.5 gigabytes of data, the GameCube discs could only store 1.5 gigabytes. This meant that some cross-platform content had to be compressed, or features removed from games entirely. Another major drawback was the lack of online gameplay. Reportedly, the GameCube only had 8 games with internet or local area network support. The console didn't feature an internal hard drive either and relied on the use of memory cards. Games which players were able to enjoy on GameCube included Super Smash Bros. Melee, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, Mario Kart Double Dash, Super Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime, Animal Crossing, and Luigi's Mansion. Nintendo got rid of the 3-pronged controller design and instead opted for a more traditional 2-pronged version. In 2002, Nintendo made a wireless controller called the Wavebird Wireless Controller, even before Xbox and PlayStation managed to do so. 2004 welcomed the arrival of the Nintendo DS. The DS standing for both Developer's System and Dual Screen according to the company, as it featured a bottom touchscreen in addition to a top display screen. The DS came with a stylus for finer touchscreen control, a built-in microphone that allowed for voice recording and voice recognition, as well as Wi-Fi capabilities. The cartridges were made much smaller than the cartridges of the Game Boy Advance. It had 2 slots, so games of both cartridges could be played on the DS, making it backwards compatible. When playing games, one screen is used to show the main action, while the other is used for things like a map, inventory, or secondary viewpoint. Due to its unique dual screen action, many new titles were unveiled by Nintendo, like Nintendogs and Brain Age. Other popular games for the DS were Super Mario 64 DS, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and new Super Mario Bros.
Yay for me, Luigi!
In keeping with tradition, a refined version of the DS came out in 2006, named the DS Lite. It was slimmer and lighter. It had a longer-lasting battery and a brighter screen. It was not the slimmest of the DS range, though, because in 2008, the new DSi model had an ultra-slim build, plus larger screens. It also introduced 2 digital cameras, but it wasn't backwards compatible. 1 year later, the DSi XL further improved upon the handheld specifications by increasing the screen sizes once more. It also had improved speakers and a longer battery life.